What's up, Rose? What's on your mind today?
Hey, Dana. Excited to get into our next episode where we have a little continuation with our guest, Tom Christopoul. But first, I thought we'd talk about something that I thought was, number one, heart-wrenching. Just heart-wrenching. And number two, it was, I thought, an excellent leadership demonstration of vulnerability and authenticity. And I don't know, did you see Jon Stewart this week on The Daily Show?
Well, I did because you flagged it for me. I actually hadn't caught it originally, but then you forwarded it. And like you said, it is
with a crying emoji.
Crying emoji. And it was about the fact that his dog, his family's dog, had passed away. And it was just heart-wrenching. I also think it's one of the, not everyone, but many people have had a pet and can relate to how brutal it is, even if it was their time, you know?
Yeah. And I a couple of things I loved about it. One, I had mentioned the authenticity and the vulnerability. And what's wild is if you watch it carefully, the audience is chuckling at the beginning because I think they believe he's setting up a joke. And he actually says, I thought I'd make it farther before my emotions got the best of me, and proceeds to tell the story about how they adopted this three-legged pit bull and how it became the studio dog, the family dog. Showed a little video of it. And then the closing quote was, I know he was tired. I know he was ready. I wasn't. And
right.
I could cry.
And that's
talking about now.
I really believe that's how most of us feel when we lose a pet. I 100%, I would use that exact same phrase for what I've done.
I wanted to start with this, Dana, because, we're always looking for teachable moments. And for me, this incredibly bright, whether you agree with his politics or not, is irrelevant. Incredibly bright, incredibly witty, incredibly funny man just shows all of his emotion in front of millions of people. And I thought it was not only heartfelt, but also brilliant from a leadership and vulnerability perspective. But the exciting thing, as we transition off of our little pop culture topic and into the next episode.
Yeah, I think we're going to hear some interesting things. I know we're going to hear some interesting things, particularly about how Tom worked with his team to navigate COVID and talk about having to acknowledge some very strong emotions that were at play at that time, frustration, exasperation. And yeah, I think the listeners are going to love it. So let's get into it. Here we go.
I'm going to jump to a story where
Is it about Marky Mark?
No, it's not about Marky Mark. It's about Tom Christopoul, actually. Okay. And we're driving, we're in a car.
Kind of the same as Marky Mark.
Yeah, exactly. Just like Marky Mark. And we're heading to the airport, and to be honest, we're just bullshitting. And Tom's telling me we're talking about COVID. It was maybe a year after COVID. And maybe it was our first board meeting.
I think it was.
It was post-COVID. And he's just telling this story. He's like, yeah, you should have seen what it was like trying to do real estate development during COVID, because let's just say, you can't build buildings over Zoom. So he proceeds to tell the story about how they had done all this planning, and, it got to the point where they had to shrink their planning cycle, if I remember the story right, to daily. Morning and maybe sometimes afternoon, stand up, kind of get your act together meetings. And there was a moment where, I worked big company. Every year we did the long strategic planning cycle. You live and die by the plan and the budget that comes with it. And that was the first moment in my career where I thought, oh my God, there is a real utility for having a management and leadership skill that's able to assess your environment and the ability to plan in that environment and pivot it. So my question to you, Tom, was I want to double click on what you were going through from a management and leadership perspective during that time, which is how did you know, shit, this isn't good? Our plan, outside the fact that people probably weren't showing up and things weren't getting done on time, what triggered that approach change in your mind? And then what were some of the things that you did to accommodate the urgency? Because it doesn't need to be COVID. It could be a supply chain issue. It could be, a global unrest, a war that impacts your customers or part of your resources. So those things, though COVID was the example in our situation, those things, honestly, when you're in management leadership positions, happen every day. Maybe not every day, but often. So I want to hear the rest of the story.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, there's plenty of, there's volumes and in fact, some sections of entire business library dedicated to crisis management, positive case studies, negative case studies, and there's plenty written on it. And everybody hopes to never be in that circumstance, but at some point, of course, they're going to be. And so the usual elements apply, right? Where you move towards a triage mentality, and there's lots written on this, and we could talk about it. What was different, of course, about COVID, and I always I marvel at the COVID experience. It's something it's really something very meaningful to have lived through. I mean, historically speaking, 100 years from now, it'll be a relevant element of history, human history, because it was a shared experience for 8 billion people on the planet, right?
Yep. Every single person went through it. Yeah, every single person.
Pick a crisis in human history. Pick one. It could be a war. It could be, it could be space landing. It could be any material element of human history. And I will tell you that was not uniformly shared. It just wasn't, because that's not the way the world works. This was our first one. 8 billion. Now, people dealt with it different. Some people don't think it ever happened. There's lots of elements of differential about it, but it was a unique experience that happened to be being shared by 8 billion people simultaneously, which doesn't happen, in the course, as they say, of human events. So the thing that I was talking to Rose about, which was slightly different, was, in any crisis, you always pivot, you always move your timeframes down, you prioritize, you work through things, and you don't particularly, you sort of eliminate the concern about knock on, let's call them, effects of your decisions, because you don't have that luxury. But COVID was slightly different because it wasn't just a crisis. It was, as I say, a crisis that was shared by everybody. And so we weren't responding to a circumstance that was unique to us. And that made it slightly different. And so what we did, which many people did in that period of time, was simply went to a daily stand-up meeting where all we were talking about and all we agreed to talk about was what that was going to happen that day. There wasn't a concern about anything beyond that. It might be about getting a subcontractor on site. It might be contending with somebody who they themselves might have been sick and weren't able to, join the call. And how are we going to kind of correspond to the absence of that resource, or maybe even more importantly, try to organize resources to get them better, or what have you. And so the thing I mentioned that I think was memorable when we were talking about it with Rose, I would start this meeting every day by saying to everybody, just let's all agree that we're going to resist the urge to be more than reactionary, right? Because that's not something that you get taught, right? To your point, exactly, Dana. How thoughtful are we being? How strategic are we being? Well, what happens? We can't organize around this because we're going to run into overtime issues with the union. I mean, there's of course an infinite number of elements that are important to management processes around planning, and so intentionally resisting the urge to be anything other than reactionary, because nobody gives you permission to be reactionary, generally speaking, certainly not in organizational life.
So true, Tom. Absolutely.
It's generally not something that is encouraged.
No, it's not celebrated at all.
So we encouraged reactionary behavior. And so it was which doesn't necessarily mean you can blow your top every 5 minutes, but I thought it was okay for people to be exasperated or frustrated in the moment, because I don't know how you can process that type of a discontinuity, right? That's a huge discontinuity, without giving people the ability to feel like any emotional, let's call it, corresponding state is a valid one, because you're not really going to get to, or what I felt we weren't going to get to, that day's triage list unless people felt like, they were at least clear and they weren't going to be clouded by this guy, this group, this team, this circumstance is asking me to do something that's literally impossible, right? And just by the way, saying on that morning call, hey, listen, I think this is impossible. Here's why, was fine, right? That was a parameter of that day's triage that was going to be sequenced for those reasons, right? And so ultimately, even by doing that, if three things came off the list, that three other things that were on the list were definitely going to get done. And so that may be part of the crisis management, let's call it canon. But what was different about COVID is we had to do that every day for almost a year, right? Until in certain places we couldn't get our construction crews on site. Like in New York City, you were out of business for probably 4 or 5 months. So that longer term, shorter term thing, I think was one of those that you just don't see very often. Hopefully we'll never see again. But it was interesting while it lasted.
Let me ask you, you just said, all these things that, like you said, often we're not encouraged to do, right? And so what, truly tactically specifically, how did you communicate that to your team, to these people you were working with? Like, it's okay to share your frustrations. It's okay to say it's impossible. Let's just focus on being reactive. I mean, those are three things that generally we're told not to do much of. So how did you just set the setting in a way that they genuinely thought it was okay, that you weren't just spewing, that you were being genuine?
I'd like to take credit for being more thoughtful than this, but I modeled the behavior.
Exactly. I acted like a human so they could too.
Yeah. And by the way, that we talk about how, elements of leadership, important elements of really good leadership reflect authenticity. That's true, I think, in any human interaction. Again, in any human enterprise, pick one, pick a university, a nonprofit, a bake sale, a car wash, an organization. Authenticity and that human connection creates meaning more than outside of just the interaction. And so, look, people will tell you, and again, books have been written about making yourself vulnerable and being, human and giving yourself dimensionality. Being, sort of very directly frustrated, and being that way in the moment, and then being able to comment on it as a part of what we're processing, I would think probably meant more to the group that I was working with than telling them it was okay to do it, right?
Yeah, love it. Love it. And the other takeaway that, I don't know, if you don't agree, let me know. The example that you gave, where you said, every day we said, this way it needs to get done, and people would say, I can't do that in the time frame allocated because of these three things. Though that was created by a global disruption, wouldn't that be a brilliant approach for your day-to-day management of your resources when you're under tremendous even schedule pressure? I mean, and I'll give you a perfect example. I'm thinking of I don't know, some of the young kids that I coach, right, that are just getting into the workplace. And they're doing things and being asked to do things, or we've been in the same situations in our career, where you sit back and you go, there's not enough hours in the day to get that done, and here's the 4 reasons. But people will sit back and not say it. They won't go.
Especially if there's an age difference. Yeah.
There's an age or a reporting structure disruption. They won't say, I understand what you're asking for, but let me tell you the work that's going to involve, and I want to do a high quality job. And it's not that I'm not going to bust my ass to get it done. So don't take this as I'm not going to put the extra hours in to get it done. But there's physically, I can't do it. And I think there's a little nugget there in that, just communicating the execution accuracy and details and realism is super powerful, even in a non-big disruption like COVID.
In my mind, it goes back to, those fundamental elements of human supervision. And look, this is human behavior. People learn how to do something, they get very good at it, they get rewarded for it. And therefore that is a self-regulating, sort of cycle. And then of course, and that's great, by the way. That's often what we're looking for in terms of, processes and repetitive elements of performance. In the meantime, what's going on outside that feedback loop is everything in the world, like everything. I mean, it could be a pandemic. It could be some element of AI innovation that makes
amen.
makes the process that's being worked on completely irrelevant, or what have you. And humans by their nature, once they get into a pattern, right? Because this works over the course of many thousands of years. They repeat them, and so intentionally being willing to interrupt your own patterns of comfort, right? Whether it's process or system or people, and be open to what somebody else is going to say, not just because it's appropriate to have them say it, but because without the expectation that they can and should say it, you're going to miss something, right? Is pretty fundamental. It just doesn't necessarily reflect a lot of people's life in the way that they go to work every day. A lot of times people will be like, right, a supervisor might say, or department head or managing director or an investment bank may say, look, I hear you. I know it's an issue. I can't deal with it. I got other priorities. Just fix it and move on. It's not that big of a deal.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that over the course of this podcast, that conversation or that interaction has happened a million times in a million different places just in the last 45 minutes. And they're not wrong. That's not absurd. And it's not even wrong necessarily in the moment. But if that's a pattern and it eliminates people's ability, and I would say more than an ability, people's obligation to talk about the things that are keeping them from accomplishing whatever it is you want them to, ultimately you're not going to be in an effective organization. You'll have at some point self-regulation of a different kind, right? At some point we all go for our feet, or with our feet. Yeah, exactly.
One key, I don't know, just little routine I had, and then I've certainly mentioned it in any type of management training, was I would always say to my staff, and in fact, I even said this when I delivered new hire orientation at Intel, was odds are your supervisor or manager isn't going to realize when you've hit that sinking underwater mark, because they're over there just trying to keep above water themselves. And so you really need to flag for your supervisor when you are reaching that level, because it will impact your quality or your well-being. And again, it's just sort of letting people know that's the right thing to do, rather than starting to sacrifice every weekend or every night, because it's just not sustainable. And then I would say that to my staff, like my direct reports, I'd be like, please tell me. I won't recognize all the time when you've reached this barely keeping your head above water. I hope I recognize it most of the time, but not every time. So please tell me if we're ever reaching that point.
Yeah, we employ a nifty little, I would call it strategy, or I don't know what it is, but we talk about this all the time. Manage by exception, and we mean what we mean, or what I mean when I say that is, if things are going according, as they say, to Hoyle, right? There's stuff going on. You got a handle on it. It's going in a direction. There's no obstacles or no material obstacles in your way that you can't solve or feel like you have the resources to solve with a team or on your own. Don't talk about it. I don't want to hear about it. I don't. And by the way, you don't want me to comment on it, because all that means is I'm right. So. And that works not just for supervisors, but for groups as well, right? What's my role? What's my contribution? Of course, but let's make sure we don't overlook the exceptions. Hey, by the way, this went way better than we thought. I'm not sure why, or this is the reason why. So let's do more of that, and let's think about why that happened. Or this definitely fell on its face. I'm not having, to your point, I don't have enough time to get this done. It's slipping on my list. So let's manage by exception, and let's not spend a single second talking about what we all expect to happen, right? And there's this corresponding thing, like if you're competent and you're left alone and you have the resources to do your gig, right? Somebody's not over managing you or micromanaging you, whatever the term of art is. You're generally happy. That doesn't mean you're supposed to not have any interaction. You're supposed to talk about, where did things go outside of the plus or minus one standard deviation? If 60% of our time is focused on those exceptions, right? The standard deviation, or let's call it the differential within that, gets much, much wider. Therefore, performance improves.
That is, I cannot wait to use that.
Definitely a hot take.
Because here's the managers who don't do one-on-ones with their staff, which I'm always like, you got to do that. At least once a month, but really more frequently. But a lot of times, and they're not wrong, they're like, I don't need to sit and have them read a list to me of everything they did that week. like that's not a good use of my time. And I'm like, you're right. That's not a good use of your time. And that's not what a one-on-one should be about. And the way you just explained it is so spot on. And it's much more concise than the way I've been doing it. So thank you. You've just improved my content, my management content.
It reminds me of the advice I give to people who are frequently have to present in front of other groups, which is all of us from time to time. And I always tell the same, this is all my only nifty rule. If you're standing in front of a group, or maybe it's a Zoom or whatever modality of communication is appropriate, and all you're doing is reading off the stuff that's on the slide, stop. Just stop.
Send out the deck.
Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
You've either made a mistake and gone to the wrong meeting, or you've completely underestimated your audience, because they can read, and presumably, and look, if you're teaching English to an ESL class, maybe that's not good advice.
True.
Always corner cases.
but in an ordinary course environment, it's almost an insult, right? Like there better be something here that makes the message memorable, or perhaps using the discussion relying on the discussion we were having before, create some element of interaction to ensure alignment. Because if what you're doing is reading from your slides, you're making a big mistake. Just period, full stop.
Wow, another great session with Tom. I think he brings some really unique perspectives.
And he keeps it, he kind of keeps it real. You know what I mean? Like he's just grounded, and he's practical, and he's not trying to, fulfill any little whatever. He's very much himself.
Yeah, I found him to be I think his experience, particularly with the role that he played in commercial real estate development in the middle of COVID, brought some really interesting perspectives. So what was your hot take?
Well, one about that specifically, it was just how human he allowed himself and his team to be. And the way he just said, I made it very clear it was okay to show frustration and exasperation. I made it really clear to say that something is impossible. And I love that, because I really think it's an overused thing in business to be like, no, everything's possible, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes it's not. And COVID was a good example of that.
Yeah. And then I also appreciated the perspective that he brought on how he manages what he called managing by exception. Meaning, when you're sitting down with your employee to talk about, how the work is going, he doesn't want to spend as much time on the accomplishments, but how can he help? What are the challenges? How can he remove roadblocks? So I thought that was a great insight, because, sometimes I think if you're listening and you're an individual contributor, you want to know how to prepare for that conversation. And if you're a manager, you want to know how to make the most effective use of the time as possible.
Yeah. And that's the thing when I work with managers and leaders who don't do regular one-on-ones with their staff. One of the reasons they don't is because they're like, I don't need to sit there and have a person read a list, kind of like I said in the pod earlier. And so I really loved his idea of share the highlights, what's going really, really well, and share what isn't going well for whatever reason. And let's talk about that. And the other stuff if it's on track, it's on track. I thought that was a really practical tip.
It was a very practical tip. So with that, it's a wrap of episode 2 with Tom Christopoul. And we are looking forward to our final session with Tom in the next pod. So thank you, and we'll see you again in the next episode.
See you later. Bye.